I would like to now introduce PHADA's Executive Director, Tim Kaiser, who will discuss today's agenda and present the opening remarks. Tim?
Thank you, Blake. Can everybody hear me all right? I assume so. Thank you for joining us today. In this session, you're going to hear some important information, the latest news about the supplemental operating fund money that Congress made available, the additional administrative fee funding, the waiver. We'll cover some of the highlights on the waiver notice. We have some concerns about Section 3 that David Weber is going to address, and I'll talk about supplemental appropriations that may be forthcoming, additional supplemental appropriations. We plan to do more of these, by the way, so please give us your feedback. I think you're going to find this discussion informative. We are doing our best to represent you right now at HUD on Capitol Hill. We've been providing, as I'm sure you've noticed, a lot of information, both in email alerts, in the Advocate newsletter, through Twitter, and certainly on our website. You're going to hear from the PHADA staff. I'm somewhat biased, obviously, but I think they're the best in the business because they have dozens of years of experience in doing what you do, working at or with housing authorities very closely. And we've been concentrating our efforts on the waivers and additional funding. We are grateful for the waivers, but we're concerned that in many cases, they're simply just going to defer a lot of the work to a later day. I've heard from numerous members who are very concerned that when we do get back to normal, if we do get back to normal, they're going to face a significant workload of deferred work. And that's particularly problematic for small agencies who don't have the staff and resources, but it's applicable to every PHA. So when we do get back to normal, HUD's regulatory regime is going to have to recognize this reality. It should reflect this reality. PHAs are going to need more relief and flexibility moving forward. As an example, Phas and CMAP scoring will have to be adjusted to account for the realities of the day and the emergencies that you all are confronting. I can assure you that PHADA is going to push this point both with the department and Congress. We're also concerned about, in the CARES Act, the reporting burdens. The Act mandates that for agencies receiving more than $150,000, you're going to have to provide significant reporting. Now, we recognize that some reporting is inevitable, but we feel like the reporting burdens should be minimal so that you can concentrate your efforts on the emergency and with the residents that you serve. So I want to thank you again for taking the time to join this webinar. Thank you for everything you're doing out there in this emergency. I can tell you that the staff and I are proud to serve you at this time. And we want to hear more from you and what you need to do your jobs during the course of this crisis. So please continue to give us that feedback. Tell us what more we can do on your behalf. And I can assure you we'll do everything we can to make that happen. With that, I am going to turn it over to Seth Embry.
Thanks, Tim. It's great to be on a call with obviously my colleagues, but all of you out in the industry across the country. I'm going to start by talking about, the funding notices. I'm starting with the operating fund. So as you should know, on April 28th, HUD released PH Notice 2020-07, which outlined its position really on the uses of the Supplemental CARES Act funding, along with previously appropriate capital and operating funds, which the CARES Act funding you should have received on May 1st in locks, which you can draw down as needed for local use. Jim Armstrong in a little bit will talk about, Arlene will talk about the Hcv funding. But the reason, Tim just talked about some advocacy we're doing, and the reason I use the term position to talk about what HUD put out in that notice is because in our view, and the view of many of you, HUD is incorrectly interpreting the plain language of the law. So the statute says that both the CARES Act supplemental funding, which for the operating fund was $685 million, and previously appropriate capital and operating funds, which all can be used fungibly and for expanded uses. The Act said that that eligibility began with the enactment of the Act, which was on March 28th. And HUD's notice 2020-07, like I said, says that you have the ability to use those the flexibilities as of the issuance of the notice, which was on April 28th. And so there's a gap there of at least a month where HUD, in our view, is prohibiting PHAs from doing what the law allows them to do. We cover in the most recent issue of the Advocate, we go into depth about the funding notice. And so I just want to highlight some issues, some items today on this call that are most relevant. So both with the use of the supplemental funds and with the use of the flexibility afforded to CARES Act and previously appropriated funds, HUD is saying that flexibility and the supplemental funds must be used by December 31, 2020. That is in accordance with the law, the CARES Act, which also allows the Secretary to extend for periods of 12 months that flexibility and the availability of those funds. But it's clear that HUD wants those funds, the emergency fund, used expeditiously in accordance with the emergency that many PHAs are operating under. And we saw that in the poll that a good portion, a majority really, of the responses to the poll that we did just a few moments ago, most of you are operating at normal or close to normal with staff working remotely and things like that. And so ideally those funds go to help continue those operations in this time of crisis. The notice also informs PHAs that the supplemental funds are subject to the normal operating fund requirements with some important exceptions. Some of those include waiving the cash flow considerations if you want to transfer operating funds between projects, and also allowing you to transfer funds to the COCC up to 50% in excess of the normal safe harbor requirements. In the notice, HUD outlines some of the new eligible activities that you can use the CARES Act funding for. I will say that it's important to note that the CARES Act allows you, the PHA, to determine what the emergency spending is that you need to do to respond to, prepare for, and plan for the coronavirus. So in addition to the eligible activities, it's really on you to think about how to best use those funds to respond to the emergency. But some of the things that HUD included in the notice are procuring personal protective equipment for staff, childcare costs for staff so they can continue to work. In many situations, in many places, schools are closed or childcare centers are closed, so additional funding so your staff can continue working. Preventive health activities, and they outline, or they give the example of transporting staff or residents for testing. Payment of staff unable to work because of local public health restrictions, and supporting the education of students by providing internet or tablets, computers, or whatever else other supplies are needed. But as I said, the notice gives you really wide authority to determine what's reasonable to prepare for and respond to coronavirus in your community. If you have additional questions, we can go over them in the Q&A, but also, like I said, I would refer you to the most recent issue of the Advocate where we go into the funding notices in depth. And with that, I'll turn it over to Arlene, who will talk about the Hcv funding notices.
Okay, thank you, Seth, and good morning or afternoon, depending on what coast you're on. And thank you all for everything you're doing. We really admire the work, and we see the dedication of so many of our members going way beyond the normal day-to-day activities to make sure your residents are safe. And that is appreciated by everyone, and we'll continue to work with HUD to get the best results for you through these notices, the waivers. I think it's interesting that most people said they want relief on waivers over funding, and it's obvious if your hands are tied and you can't do your job, it doesn't matter how much funding you have. And we appreciate that, and we'll work hard for you. So the notice for administrative funding was also issued the same day as the operating last week. And this funding under CARES covers both housing choice voucher and mainstream. So there was $400 million for HAP and $850 million for admin fees and other expenses. And just because the HAP notice isn't out yet, I will just mention that. So, because we've gotten questions about that, and I know people are interested, and we've heard those questions on the call-ins with HUD every week. And for anyone who hasn't been on those calls, basically what HUD is saying is they're reviewing data they're receiving from housing authorities, but will need to do that for a few months to see which agencies need funding the most. And they probably will not finish that process till maybe early July. So I don't think you'll see any HAP funding till the end of July or early August. But they will be dispersing those funds based on the agencies that are in shortfall position. They have said, second to that, agencies that have seen a significant increase in their HAP payments because tenant incomes, excuse me, have gone down. So we'll keep you updated about that, and you'll see more about that when the notice comes out. Regarding the admin fees themselves, HUD is putting out this funding in 2 tranches. This first one is for $380 million. I did hear Hunter Kurtz mention on a phone call this week, $360 million. So if anyone heard that and was wondering which it is, the notice states $380 million. So not to disagree with Assistant Secretary Kurtz, but I think it is $380 million. So that funding will be, the remaining $470 million will be somewhere down the road. We don't have an exact date on that yet from HUD. Basically, they're still considering how that second round will be allocated, but again, their priority is based on need. They have stated that will be the primary consideration. So as far as the $380 million goes, that amount was determined based on looking at housing authorities calendar year 2018 and 19 average monthly eligibility. And they took that amount at 100% proration and then multiplied the monthly average by 2. And they did that to address any spikes that might have occurred over that 2-year period. In terms of the timeline, so this has been a little controversial. We've heard from many members already, and we've heard members state these things to HUD as well. So HUD is very much aware from members and from PHADA and other industry groups that unlike the operations notice that Seth just spoke about, which states the date that funds can be allocated towards CARES Act funding, monies that you spend, the administrative fees notice does not give a date. And HUD has, it's not stated in the notice, but HUD has stated when asked that they interpret that date to be the date of the notice, which is April 28th, meaning that any funds expended before that time on COVID-related activity could not be charged those funds. So we obviously realized that would be a significant problem. I actually thought when Todd Thomas said it on a phone call that he misspoke and meant March 28th, the same date that Seth had mentioned, but it turned out that that is HUD's position. They're citing it as statutory. We don't have the exact language before us, but we have already written a letter. Our executive committee is reviewing it today. We're laying out what our concerns are and that we think HUD's interpretation is wrong. I will say, because PIH, Public and Indian Housing, has been supportive, we think that they are in line with our interpretation, and others in the building at HUD don't agree. So we'll work through that, but we're going to take the letter to the Hill, and we hope to have some kind of language in future legislation that's being considered right now for the next supplemental CARES Act. But we've actually spoken to congressional staff who seem supportive and understand, and said it probably happened because so many people are involved in the writing of the bill, and the bill was written so quickly. So we'll keep you apprised of that, and if you have any more specific questions about that, you can put those in the Q&A. but we're on it. So I just wanted everyone to know that. The next section I'll talk about is eligible expenses. So I think the notice was written very confusingly, and I think a lot of members did as well, because we've gotten lots of emails about that, and I've heard many questions on calls with HUD. And I think there's a few reasons for it. So I'm just going to state it as matter-of-factly as I can, not following sort of the outline of the notice itself. The easiest way to say this is that the CARES Act administrative fee funding for both HCV and mainstream can be used for COVID-19 related eligible expenses, as well as any ongoing regular HCV program operations during the period where the program is affected by COVID-19. And that last bit is important, and I think it's why, so Hunter Kurtz was on a call, and he stated that while that is true, agencies need to be careful to track those funds and note what date the funds are being spent. Because if you were using your normal, if you were covering normal administrative fee expenses, like the kinds of expenses you always cover, during the COVID-related period, that could be problematic. I mean, if it wasn't during the COVID-related period. If it is, it's not a problem. So if it's late in the year, and it's not really clear to me how they'll make that determination, you know, what standard of government they'll use. Will it be a CDC notice? I'm not sure. Just thinking about it right now, I realize they really haven't said, how do we know when that period's over? So, you know, maybe we can get some follow-up from HUD on that, because that just seems like a loose end. But Hunter Kurtz is advising people to track that carefully by date. So then the second question we got is, you know, a lot of people seem confused about what the funds could be spent for, and HUD gave a few examples. They say necessary upgrades to information technology or computer systems to enhance telework capacities, and we know that many people are doing that. Overtime for HA staff to carry out voucher program responsibilities. And then another caveat they had was any other new COVID-19 related activities to support or maintain the health and safety of assisted individuals and families, as well as any costs related to the retention and support of participating owners, landlords in the voucher program. And I'll get into that a little bit more, the incentive part of it, because when I talk about the eligible activities, we had a few questions there from some of our members who I think are listening today. So I'll just go through very quickly the main points of the new eligible activities. So Seth said some of them, and they're similar, but cleaning supplies and or services to clean, relocation of families to healthier sites, because you want to limit the exposure if they use mass transportation, supportive services, the cost to retain landlords, including incentives. And one agency asked, what does that actually mean? And just like many agencies provide incentive costs for landlords to participate, like MTW agencies, for example, can do that. So you're paying the owner an additional amount of money to recognize the fact that it is more difficult to lease under these circumstances when there are stay-at-home orders, etc. And it's to encourage landlords to participate because they get this extra amount of money, which you can determine yourselves to get them to participate. So it's just one way to attract more landlords to the program. And I actually think it's, you know, not a bad idea because many landlords already want incentive fees without the COVID-related activities. Childcare for HA staff, so they can come to work if they don't have their daycare anymore because of this crisis we're in. Costs related to the delivery of goods, including food and medical supplies, which many of our members are doing that for residents. But Hunter Kurtz pointed out you can't charge the food itself or the supplies. You can only charge the cost of delivery. And that's something we asked if that could be included in some of the language that the House is putting together. We made that point, so maybe they'll include that in the future. Then security costs, just say. And then the last thing I'll say is anything that isn't on the list, and that's just about the whole list. There might be one or two others, but you can look at the notice. Anything not on the list, you can write to HUD and ask them to include something else that you're considering. And if HUD says yes, then they'll add it to the list, and they keep that running list on their COVID webpage. So they encourage people to write in with other ideas that you might have, how you want to spend your money. Let's see. I guess in terms of period availability, the funds are available until the end of this year. HUD has said that date could be extended. And so the point being that since you have FY20 admin funds to use, and you have these COVID-related funds to use, the suggestion is made to use the FY20 funds first to use the COVID funds first, because the admin funds from FY20 can be rolled over where the others cannot. So we would make that suggestion, as would HUD. They have already. And then in terms of the FY20 appropriations, one other thing that stood out is a little bit confusing in the notice. So while your admin fees that you receive for FY20 can be used for COVID-related activities, that's not true for mainstream. Mainstream admin fees for FY20 cannot be used for COVID, but just to reiterate that the funds you receive for admin fees under CARES can be used for either HCV or mainstream. So it doesn't go both ways. And then the last thing I'll talk about just briefly is reporting requirements. There are some reporting requirements in the notice. Additional guidance is coming. What HUD said is that they hadn't made a lot of the decisions that they needed to make, but they wanted to get the funds out quickly to housing authorities for obvious reasons. So they didn't make every determination that needed to be made. And some other guidance will be coming soon, which is Phas guidance and accounting and remittance guidance. There is some reporting requirements that we have problems with, and members have told us they do as well. And we will definitely, we think that the language came out of the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. They just simply cut and pasted into the legislation. And there's really some onerous reporting requirements there that you don't need at a time like this. So we'll continue to work with HUD to see if we can address those for our members. And so just to let you know, we realize that language is problematic, and we're already working on it. And so with that, I will turn it over to Jim Armstrong? David Weber. I'm sorry, David. No, I am so sorry. I lost my head.
I believe Seth is next.
Yeah, I'm up.
Okay.
I was just looking at the agenda. I was like, wow, that was quick.
Everyone's entitled to one glitch. That was my glitch.
There you go. Okay, so we're going to get into the waiver notices now. Now, if you remember, these came out earlier in, well, I guess it is May now, so back in April, and they were covered extensively in an article that I wrote with Jim in the, April 29th issue of the Advocate. Jim's going to talk about the public housing waivers. I'll talk briefly about HCV again. Like I said, these are covered really in depth, and so I don't want to go over too much of that. But if there are specific questions about waivers, again, put those in the Q&A and we'll get to them. But I do want to say that the first thing is that if you implement any of the waivers, obviously they're optional, but if you implement them, there are 3 things you need to do. Maintain records of which waivers were implemented and when they were effective. You do need to maintain compliance with local board approval and oversight requirements unless you waive them. So in the HCV program, you can implement changes to your administrative plan without board approval, as that's one of the available waivers. And then lastly, you need to provide resident notifications of changes in policies that result from waivers that you choose to implement. So those 3 things are really key. In addition to the fact that you do want to ensure that even though there are waivers in terms of working with the board, seeking board approval first, to the extent that you can, you do want to maintain operations as close to normal. As Tim said, the waivers, when it comes to inspections, when it comes to recertifications, all HUD is doing is pushing work from the kind of first part of the year to the second part of the year. And that can be really overwhelming for an agency if it chooses to do that. We're working to relieve agencies of a lot of that work, but just be mindful of what the requirements are as of today. So annual recertifications, so I'm going to get into, I think, 5 of the waivers. Annual recertifications that are due up until July 31 can be deferred until later in the year. They do have to be completed this calendar year, but they can be deferred up until December 31. Inspections, HQS inspections, both for your tenant-based and project-based vouchers, you can defer those. Again, those that are due before July 31, if you're doing annual or biannual, also your initial inspections and your PBV inspections. You can accept owner certifications until July 31, and then all inspections have to be performed by October 31. So if you accept an owner certification for an inspection that's due this month, you still have to complete that inspection before October 31. And also with that, you still have to have procedures in place, and you should communicate these with your landlords and your tenants about how you'll conduct any special inspections. Although those are waived, you still need to communicate your policies, as I mentioned before. Annual plans, those due dates have been pushed back. There's a grid, I think, in the notice, and we talked about it in our article about those dates. But important to note that these significant amendment requirements are waived until July 31. Eiv monitoring. So although there's a self-certification, the waiver that allows self-certification to be the highest form of verification is one waiver. Separate from that, the routine Eiv monitoring that you do on a monthly basis probably is waived until July 31. And then the last thing I want to note is that CMAP scoring and submission requirements are also waived. HUD says it'll begin issuing new CMAP scores starting with the PHAs that have fiscal year ends of March 31 of next year. As Tim already mentioned, because of all the waivers that are available to you this year, in addition to the changes in operations, potential changes in operations, it's hard to fathom how HUD will simply resume issuing scores without first altering the criteria, altering the scoring, and things of that nature. And so they haven't released any plans, but we're in communications with the department about that issue as well. And also in that notice, we recommended additional waivers to be implemented by HUD. And so Arlene talked about how you can request additional eligible uses for Hcv admin funding under the CARES Act. HUD is also accepting, per the pre-CARES Act process, additional waiver requests. So you can submit those to HUD as normal. That's detailed in the notice. But we asked for a few waivers, a number of waivers really, that we think should be applied broadly to the industry, including waiving the requirement for documentation for eligibility to be received by the PHA within 60 days of the voucher issuance. Obviously, if there's any interruption in work and the family has submitted their eligibility documents, if for whatever reason you can't get the voucher issued within 60 days, we don't want the family nor the PHA to be inconvenienced. The income verification waivers that allow for self-certification to be the highest form of verification only apply for annual and interim recertifications, and we've asked HUD to consider allowing PHAs to apply that to initial certifications. With your annuals and interims, if you accept the self-certification, you still have to take any necessary enforcement actions if it's later determined to be a discrepancy between, say, the reported income and the actual income. You still have to do that on the back end. Some PHAs have asked that the requirement to accept incoming reports be waived. In some areas, social distancing and quarantine make it really impossible to conduct a housing search. We'll have actually a poll question a little bit later about what's going on in the community. We're really eager to hear back. But anyway, in those areas, it would really be infeasible for a family to port into your community, conduct a housing search. And so it would be an unnecessary burden for housing authorities and a great inconvenience for participants to force housing authorities to accept income reports if they can't be assisted. The last waiver I want to note, and the full list again is in our article, is for HUD to automatically extend any designated housing plans due for renewal this calendar year. So HUD has given itself a waiver to consider on an elongated basis submissions for renewals for designated housing plans. And we think it would be in line with the current crisis and HUD's acknowledgement of the work that those take to just automatically extend them all at least through the end of the year. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jim to talk about public housing.
Thank you. Thank you, Seth. And I hope everybody is doing well and staying safe. A couple of things. Seth covered a number of the waivers that apply to public housing. I do want to talk about a couple of overarching issues that you all probably need to be aware of. First of all, I think we do need to recognize the CARES Act was enacted on March 28th. HUD's notice on waivers was out on April 10th, which for the department is really the speed of light. And I think that they do deserve some credit for getting that notice out to us as quickly as they have. I also want to acknowledge and mention to everybody on this webinar that Assistant Secretary Kurtz has said on a number of occasions that they understand that they have not gotten everything right concerning waivers that might be helpful to housing authorities, and they welcome suggestions. So not just PHADA, but if you all have suggestions concerning waivers, either existing waivers that could be amended to make them more useful, or other issues that the department should consider concerning waivers, I think everybody should feel free to make those suggestions to the department. There is an email account, I believe it's PIH COVID-19@HUD.org or something like that. It's on the department's website. It's probably on our website as well. And you can send emails to that. And actually, several of us have sent emails to that site, and it's been fairly responsive. So think about doing that. So what I'd like to do, HUD mentioned the waiver potential concerning annual reexaminations, and he's right on target. One of the things that I don't understand, and I think it would be a reasonable recommendation, is the department has effectively allowed agencies to defer annual recertifications this year. I don't understand why they simply don't waive the requirement and have agencies start up with reexaminations next year if they wish to. It seems a much cleaner and less burdensome process, and it doesn't mean that agencies would find themselves jammed up at the end of the year with much larger workloads than they had anticipated under normal circumstances. On the verifications issue, the department has through July 31st allowed agencies to use self-certifications from residents and participants concerning income and family composition in relationship to annual and interim reexaminations. And they seem to couch this as a big deal. That even the department's notice in 2018 and earlier have indicated that self-certification has always been an acceptable, although least desirable, way to verify information from residents. The difference between what they've allowed you to do until July 31st and what you've always been able to do is that until July 31st, you will not need to provide any justification in, say, resident files concerning why you elect to use self-certification. After July 31st, if you need to use self-certification, you're free to do so under earlier HUD notices. You just need to provide some justification for that in the tenant files. I want to mention a few of the public housing waivers that may be of interest. And again, as Seth mentioned, these are covered in fair detail in the April 29th advocate. So I'm not going to go into that level of detail. Concerning ACOP changes, if you want to make changes to your policies on admission and continued occupancy, you may do so without board approval. I still think it's wise to stay in touch with your board, particularly your chairman, make sure they're aware of what you're up to, but there's no need to hold a meeting or a virtual meeting and get a vote of the board to adopt any changes. However, you will need to do that, I believe the notice says, as quickly as practicable after July 31st. Energy audits due this year are deferred until next year. Over income, families who are over income subject to that alternative rent calculation, you won't need to do that for this year if families are over income. However, the time that families are over income during this period appears to count towards their 2-year, 24-month break before any new income calculation methods are applied. If you have any resident council elections scheduled between now and July 31st, you can delay those, but again, the notice encourages you to complete that process as quickly after July 31st as you can. Utility allowance changes that are due may be deferred, but if they're due during 2020, you're going to have to complete them during 2020, although you won't have to complete ones that might be coming due between now and July 31st. Which brings me to another sort of overarching issue that I think is important. The department seems to have presumed that all of these troubles and restrictions that we operate under are going to be over and done with by the end of July. I think that's speculative and probably a bit optimistic, and I think it'll probably depend on where you are. Some localities may still have significant restrictions on your ability to operate normally. Others may not, and you'll need to pay attention to what those restrictions are. But I suspect that there'll be some agencies by July 31st that are still operating under circumstances similar to what we're operating under now. I do want to mention also the capital fund. The department has delayed capital fund obligation and expenditure deadlines for funds that are outstanding by a year. So you don't, if you have funds that have to be obligated this year, you have until next year to take care of it, and the same is true with expending those funds. I want to talk for a minute about assessment systems. As Seth mentioned with CMAP, HUD has announced that it will not be publishing new CMAP and Phas scores this year unless agencies ask for them to be published. Some agencies may expect that their Phas and CMAP scores will improve, and they'd like to be able to talk about those scores in their localities. But unless agencies request that those scores be published, HUD will not be publishing CMAP and Phas scores during 2020. The CMAP and Phas issue that's of most concern, I think, is what happens next year. The department's notice does not speak to what it may do in connection with scoring these assessment systems after the pandemic and the aftermath of the pandemic have passed. And obviously, your operations may be significantly impacted by what's going on right now, and may have impacts if the department starts scoring CMAP and Phas next year under the standard protocol using this year's information. So we have a concern about that. We've raised the question with the department. I don't think it's something that they have come to grips with as yet. The inspection program that operated out of REAC, all inspections are suspended until further notice, so you don't have to worry about inspections that may have been scheduled or supposed to be scheduled in the near future. And until Dave Vargas is responsible for that office in HUD, and until Vargas announces a recommencement of inspections, those inspections will not occur. Seth mentioned the Eiv suspension of monitoring through the end of July. I want to mention also that the department has suspended the community and self-sufficiency community service and self-sufficiency requirements for public housing residents that may crop up this year. So if families come in for verification of compliance with that requirement, you will not be under burden to verify that information this year. A question we've raised, which has resulted in a very confusing response, is again, what happens to those requirements next year? So if a family is a May 1st re-examination, and ordinarily they would have to establish compliance with CSS on May 1st for the prior 12 months, you won't have to do that this year. May 1st of 2021, what do they need to do? And at the moment, it seems as though they will need to provide you with verification that they met the CSS requirement for 8 hours of community service or work each month between May 1st, 2020 and April 30th, 2021, which seems nonsensical to us. Again, a more straightforward approach the department could take on that score is simply to suspend CSS requirements for the year and instruct agencies to begin CSS compliance in 2021 and not worry about families' compliance with that requirement during 2020. We haven't discussed it, but these are potential suggestions that folks could make to the department concerning additional waivers that they might take into consideration. And that about covers the notes that I had concerning waivers affecting public housing and some of the overarching issues that we want you all to be aware of. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jim. I think I am up next. Just a quick reminder, we are looking at questions and we'll address those towards the end. Please use the Q&A feature from the bottom if you want to submit a question. I'm going to talk just for a minute or two about the eviction moratorium. The federal eviction moratorium covers the period from March 27th to July 24th, and it prohibits new eviction filings for non-payment of rent or for rent-related charges. So it is only for non-payment or of rent or non-payment of, say, late fees or other accrued charges. And you can also not charge new late fees or administrative fees during that covered period. Other evictions for safety or security reasons can proceed. I would point out that many states and localities have adopted their own eviction moratoriums and various rules. So make sure you know what your local rules are, because they may be different and may be more stringent, covering all kinds of different evictions and may have different timeframes as well. That often comes from the courts in some of those states. I would also mention that the HUD has interpreted this to include terminations of housing choice voucher assistance. I think that's their way of sort of getting around the apparent conflict between a federal instruction on something that's really governed by local law. So they're just saying you can't terminate assistance under the voucher program, as a way to try to prevent evictions for non-payment in the voucher program. There is actually, HUD actually does have a quite good tenant flyer that outlines what the federal eviction moratorium covers. It reminds tenants that rent is still due, and at this time, those rental back rents will be accruing to folks. Of course, HUD encourages public housing agencies and all landlords to work with their tenants on extending payment plans and other things. Certainly, if you need to modify your payment plan policy, as Jim mentioned, you can do that under the ACOP and delay the board approval of that process until somewhat later. I think that the link to the tenant flyer has been posted in the chat feature, so folks can look at that. So that, I think, covers the eviction moratorium. On Section 3, the initial notice from HUD indicated that delays in reporting for Section 3 had to be requested individually or were delayed until June 30th. Was not entirely clear. We followed up with the Office of Fair Housing and they did clarify that and issued a notice that extended the deadline for Section 3 reporting until July 31st. So that no SPEARS reporting has to be completed until July 31st. We understand that the social distancing requirements and the changes to operations make complying with a lot of the Section 3 activities difficult. We can't do in-person outreach. We have to move to doing mailings, emails, texts, and public postings. where we're doing, and I would mention, we've heard from a couple of folks that texting can really work well. A lot of residents do utilize that, and that I guess Google Voice and some other services do provide ability to text from the computer. So that might be something to look into. We also have to move to online training programs or online counseling, online interviews. It's much more difficult to do, but it's still possible to the extent that you or your contractors are still doing hiring or contracting activity. Then according to HUD, the Section 3 requirements continue to apply. Some of the situation does create some opportunities perhaps for Section 3 activities, such as hiring or contracting with Section 3 firms and individuals for some new services, such as cleaning services that you may now be engaging in. I would also highlight the public exigency provisions of the procurement regulations at 2 CFR 200 do allow for some, sort of bypassing the full competitive process in order to get services fast. As long as you document your reasons for moving through that, so that can also create some opportunities. We will continue to work with HUD to potentially further extend that reporting deadline. And I guess the last piece is that, there's a proposed new rule out on Section 3 that has been covered in the Advocate. We do have some concerns about it, but there's no information at this point and no timeline that we've been able to discover about if and when a final rule for Section 3 will be published. So certainly it's our hope, and we would urge them not to issue any new rules during this period. And we're hopeful that they'll do that. We will continue to make that point with them. So I think that was all I was covering for today, and I'll turn it back over to Tim to talk about potential additional supplemental.
Thanks, David.
Appropriations.
Thank you, David. Yeah, Section 3, I think, is a great example of where the department is going to have to ease up on its regulatory regime, given the realities of the day. So up to this point, we're roughly 2 months into the crisis, and trillions of dollars have been spent on federal programs, including ours. So where are we right now? Some members of Congress describe the situation as if we're in a pause now, and we need to see how what the spending effect is on the situation and in addressing the economic problems. Congress is going to take up another package. That is clear. There's a lot of focus, a lot of attention on the problems facing state and local governments. State and local governments are hemorrhaging funds from lost tax revenue and the economic inactivity. It's really a crisis in many states and communities around the country. So that is going to be a big focus of the next legislative package. The House is working on a package as we speak. They are talking about coming back as early as next week, perhaps the week after. The timeline is unclear, but right before we came on to this webinar, the PHADA staff received an email update about the House package, and one media outlet was referring to the House package as Rooseveltian in nature, meaning that it will be a large Great Depression type piece of legislation to address the economic crisis, in addition to the health crisis that we're facing. In the Senate, I talked to a Senate appropriations staffer just today. He said their attitude right now is to wait and see what the House does when they come back. But certainly the Senate is open to considering additional legislation. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said that the Senate Republicans are very concerned about the business liability implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. Some businesses are afraid to open because of the potential liability that they may confront. So that is a legitimate concern. And President Trump is interested in potentially enacting payroll tax waiver or reduction in the next round of legislation. So we can assure you housing is on the agenda, especially for the House. We're talking with House staff by the minute in terms of trying to get our priorities in that legislation. Our ask is in an April 8th letter that is on the PHADA coronavirus website. You can take a look at that. It's a joint letter we did with NARO, CLAFA, the MTW Collaborative, and hundreds of individual housing authorities signed on to that letter. And what is in it? We're asking for $5 billion more in public housing funding. This includes $2 billion more to cover lost revenues that you are facing during this pandemic. $1.5 billion for mitigation, operation costs, the huge cost of IT that many agencies are confronting, the need to upgrade systems, emergency staffing. I know I've talked to several members who are bringing in professional cleaning crews. So that's why we think as much as $5 billion more in operating fund may be necessary. And I will tell you, these estimates we developed these working in collaboration with our industry partners. We've given it our best estimating, efforts, but it's possible more or perhaps even less may be needed. But for now, we're asking for an additional $3.5 billion in HAP and administrative fee funding. Again, for the huge losses in jobs, tenant rental income that you all are seeing and experiencing throughout the country. The economic losses are in the billions. They're just staggering. So trying to estimate these numbers is very difficult. But again, our estimate is an additional $3.5 billion for administrative voucher and administrative costs. And we're also arguing for a robust increase in voucher funding, given the job losses that have occurred throughout the country. We think additional affordable housing will be necessary. And so along with our fellow colleagues in the industry, we're calling for a significant increase in the number of vouchers appropriated. And then lastly, we're calling for a significant infusion of capital funding as part of a stimulus or infrastructure package that we think Congress should appropriate in this next round. We all know the huge backlog in unmet capital funds that exists out there, and we think that Congress should include at least a down payment on capital funding as part of the infrastructure package in the next or future rounds of legislation. So that is a major PHADA priority as we're moving forward. So what's the timing of this? When may we see another round of legislation in this potentially Rooseveltian House package? As I said, we think the House is going to come back in the next couple of weeks. There was some talk about remote voting, but right now it appears as if the House will be coming back to Washington to take that up. So I would suspect we'll see that in the next couple of weeks, their return. And then, as I said, the Senate will take a wait and see approach. And then I think they will consider legislation if the House does act. So our request is in, as are several others that are pending here in Washington. As was mentioned, I think, by Seth and Arlene, we are sending a letter to the Hill tomorrow, trying to address this timing problem with respect to the use of CARES Act funding. So that is a big priority of PHADA's that we're acting on imminently, by tomorrow, the latest. You all can be very helpful to pushing these funds through Congress by looking at our April 8th letter that's on the PHADA coronavirus website. Use that in your own advocacy with your 2 senators, your representatives, and, you know, continue to be in contact with us here at PHADA. So that's the conclusion of our presentations. I see we have about a half an hour. I know, Blake, we have gotten a lot of good questions, and we can have a dialogue in the remaining minutes, the remaining half hour of this presentation. Before I do turn it over to Blake, I encourage you at the end to give us your feedback. We are planning to do more of these. We're hoping that people will find these informative. We're going to ask some of our members and leadership to join us in those sessions. So look for additional announcements about coming sessions pretty soon. So with that, Blake, I'll turn it over to you, and we can start addressing some of the questions.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Tim, and thanks everyone for your information today. I'm sure it's very helpful for people. We are going to be answering your questions. We have gotten a lot. Just a reminder, please post the questions using the Q&A link rather than the chat. We'll try and get to all of them. We don't only have a half hour, so we'll answer as many as we can. Before we do, though, we are going to do one more polling session here. We have 4 short questions, so please answer these now, and we will share the results in 1 minute. Okay, the results are in. For question number 1, what is the status of leasing in your Housing Choice Voucher program? 39% said largely unaffected by the crisis, 26% we've stopped issuing vouchers, and 34% said that we are issuing vouchers, but families are having a very difficult time due to local travel restrictions. For question number 2, did your agency spend any administrative or operating funds to prepare and respond to COVID-19 prior to April 28th? 81% overwhelmingly said yes, 19% said no. Question number 3, is your agency planning to utilize the fungibility of public housing funding? Just about split, 51% say yes, 49% say no. And the final question, does your housing or your PHA typically utilize the emergency solution grant funds? 6% said yes, and 94% said no. Okay, so we are going to move on to our Q&A session now. We've got about 27 minutes or so. Arlene Kahn, one of our policy analysts, just had a brief statement she wanted to make. So I'll turn it over to Arlene, and then we'll get into the Q&A. Arlene?
Yes, thank you, Blake. The one thing that I didn't mention of all the eligible activities that you could spend administrative fees on is one that I think that a lot of agencies are utilizing right now. So I just wanted to be clear and state it. It may even be in the questions, but you can use that funding for overtime. And that prompted a question because the way HUD wrote it in the notice, they mentioned overtime as an example of some administrative costs that you might use the funds for, to which we had the question, can you use it for regular staff pay? And yes, because that is part of spending for admin fees. So you can use it for regular pay and you can use it for overtime pay. Just want to make that clarification. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Arlene. All right, so we now come to our Q&A for this part of the webinar. And we've gotten quite a bit of questions. I don't know if we will get to all of them, but we will absolutely answer them on a section, our new webinar section of our website, which will be up soon. So let's start off with the first question here. It says, the start date for eligible expenses of April 28th is of concern. Most supplies were ordered and paid for prior to that date. If we would have waited until 4/28, we would have been out of luck as supplies are depleted and on back order. So does anyone have anything that they would want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll just say, oh, I'm sorry, Jim. That's, really both that, and we've seen other comments about that, and that's really the heart of our concern. One is that, just because of the nature of things, the event happened, Congress responded, then later HUD responded, but all along that timeline, PHAs were already springing into action. So it doesn't make any sense, number one, because the law allows PHAs to have used funding for those purposes. And two, it's crystal clear that it was an absolute need. So that's really the heart of our concern with HUD's interpretation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Jim, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
There we go.
Okay.
So Tim mentioned that we're sending a letter to policymakers tomorrow. I'm guessing, Tim, that letter will be available on our website after we, thank you, after we get that out. We're copying senior leadership at the department as well as policymakers. And so I would urge anybody, and I'm gathering from the Q&A that a lot of people have concerns over this rather ridiculous interpretation the department has made so far. I would urge anybody to contact your senators and your congressperson and let them know that you're concerned about this problem. If you have examples of what problems is causing, tell them. You don't need to contact the DC office. You can contact the in-state constituent services folks to get the message to your senators and to your congresspeople. But I think the more noise that you make about this problem, the more likely it is that we'll see a rapid resolution. There's no, we still haven't been able to find any justification for the department's position, nor for the department's change in its position from saying it's April 28th as the beginning date till it's May 1st as the beginning date.
Blake, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I just want to supplement what Jim said. We will be emailing that letter out tomorrow to members. It's going to Congress tomorrow. We will send it to all PHADA members. It's being copied to Secretary Carson and others at HUD. Feel free to use the whole letter, parts of the letter in your own congressional contacts. And I would urge you to contact Secretary Carson about it as well. That's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tim. All right, actually this next question was posed, what can we do to make COVID op and Section 8 funds retroactive? We've incurred significant expense prior to the effective dates of this notice. So I think this, Tim had indicated he was going to answer this. And
well, that's really, it's the same thing, Blake.
Right.
We need to get to Congress and the department. And as I said, that PHADA letter, Blake, you don't know it yet, but you will be emailing that out early tomorrow morning to our members.
Excellent. All right, moving right along. Next question. The deferral of activities like re-exams, inspections, etc., seem to be a good first step. However, the need to complete this work later will create backlogs, leading to other expenses. Is HUD considering completely waiving the requirements as opposed to just deferring? I think, Seth, you had indicated you would
Sure.
answer this.
And so I covered this briefly when I talked about the waivers for the voucher program. And so it looks like Jim, my old boss, asked that question. So I think, agencies really have to be very deliberate about how they, not only if they choose to or have no choice but to defer work, but when they start scheduling that work to be completed. So even though you have until, for instance, the end of the year to complete your research, you probably don't want to wait until, September or October to start thinking about how you get that done. So even if you're deferring the work, the time is really now to figure out when you're going to do that, because we are pushing hard, both with HUD and on the Hill, to get additional relief from PHAs. But as of right now, we don't know what will be the outcome. HUD, the legislation that Congress has put forward, they've really tried to be very broad and give HUD a lot of authority. And so HUD does have the authority to waive those research, to waive those inspections. And so we're asking them to do that. And just like Jim talked about, you contacting your congressperson on the funding piece, they also can make calls over to HUD and say, hey, my constituents are having these issues. You have the authority, please lend a helping hand. And so we definitely hear and agree with that point.
Great, thank you, Seth. All right, the next question we have here, and I think this may have been answered already, but it's worth restating. Does buying masks and sanitizer and cleaner give to tenants count towards CARES Act money?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, okay. All right, the next question here is anything being done to increase the time frames and what what housing choice voucher admin money can be spent on? Again, I think we've kind of touched on this, but does anybody want to specifically answer that?
So I think the question means beyond the end of the year, and HUD has already said that they'll consider that. Some people seem more enthusiastic when we ask the question, yes, of course, we can consider that. And others seemed a little, I thought, more begrudging. But I feel that it's pretty clear if there are still needs, we'll be able to make sure that HUD extends that deadline.
Okay.
But the sooner you spend the funds, the better off you'll be.
Yeah, right. Okay, this next question is regarding audit requirements. Will due dates into REACT be adjusted for audited and unaudited submissions? I think, Seth, you...
Yeah, so in our article, in our waiver article, we talk about those financial reporting compliance dates. So briefly, for housing authorities, if you have a fiscal year end of December 31 of 19 or March 31, 2020 for your unaudited financial information, those deadlines were extended by 6 months. For audited financial information, if you had a fiscal year end on June 30 last year, September 30 last year, December 31 last year, or March 31 of this year, the deadline for submission of audited financial statements also was extended by 6 months.
Great, thank you, Seth. Okay, next question. We are only performing emergency work orders. This, along with the delay of inspections, can lead to issues that will greatly burden our maintenance staff to be REACT ready. My concern is that we will be sent a 14-day REACT notice once this reopens, and we cannot possibly be ready. We were scheduled for REACT 3 days after the postponement announcement, so this has been, has been a discussion about when that will be scheduled when things resume. It would seem unfair to begin only 14 days notice given extreme circumstances. So, Tim, did you have something?
Yeah, this is again an example of what I meant when I said before that HUD's regulatory regime is going to have to be adjusted to account for the emergencies that agencies are that are dealing with right now. This is actually I have discussed this scenario with numerous PHADA members very recently, including our president, John Hodge, John Mahon in New Jersey, and many others are very worried about this scenario. And so we're going to continue to push for REACT, for the department to defer both inspections down the road, but also to adjust the scoring systems, as Jim Armstrong pointed out before, to account for the difficulties that you all are encountering. And I do want to say, just in about 45 minutes, we'll be on a call with HUD. The Assistant Secretary Hunter Kurtz and his team, including David Vargas of REAC. And I will tell you, David Vargas completely gets it. He's been very understanding about this situation and very cooperative. So I think we're going to be able to successfully make that argument to Mr. Vargas. We're going to be in constant communication with him and others at the department on that point. Rest assured, we're aware of this problem, and as Arlene aptly put it before, we're on top of it. We are on top of it.
I just want to add that when the webinar on vouchers, REAC inspections were the only thing that I recall the department has actually suspended until further notice. Everything else has got a bunch of dates associated with it, but the REAC inspections are suspended until further notice. What that means to me, at least, is that when they decide that they may be able to restart inspections, and that also means getting the inspectors up to speed and onto some sort of schedule, that they would then publish a notice. And I would suspect that the notice would provide folks with ample lead time in terms of when they can expect to start hearing from inspectors. So at any rate, I think in addition to the points that Tim has made, I think operationally, it's going to take them a bit of time to get an inspection process restarted.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, next question. You made mention that COVID-19 admin funds will have a period of use for related COVID-19 activities that begin either with the act or notice and will end at some unknown date that is defined by the period of the COVID-19 epidemic. However, the funds must be used by December 31st, 2020. So can you clarify this question? If the government determines that COVID emergency epidemic period ends prior to 12/31/2020, and if we have not obligated or spent the HCV COVID admin fees that would no longer be eligible to spend, would they be subject to recapture? So.
Yeah.
Okay.
The answer is yes, they would be subject to recapture. So let me just make it more clear in terms of everything you were told during my session. So the start date is not determined because of all the things we've discussed that we think HUD has misinterpreted this. So there is no start date in the notice itself, and the end date is December 31st, 2020. So any funds not expended by that date will be recaptured unless HUD decides to extend the period for which you can use those funds, but we won't know that. I mean, they said they would look at that. They'll consider it over the next months, and I think that would be a decision that's made right up until that point, because we just don't know. Everybody's heard this COVID-19 might come back in the fall. If that happened, would we have another round of activities? And so I think we just have to wait and see on that. But the short answer to your question at the end there was yes. The funds will be recaptured, and that's why I had said at one point to use your COVID money first, because your admin fees from FY20 could still be used for COVID-related purposes even after December, if you determined that they needed to be used, even though, well, actually, I'm sorry, let me take that back. They have to be used during the period when COVID-19 is in effect. So I guess if HUD says it's over on December 2020, you probably won't be able to use your regular admin funds, but obviously you won't lose your regular admin funds, right? So it's important to use up the COVID-19 admin funds first, so you don't lose them.
So I think Arlene made the point, but I also want to point out, because some questions have appeared in the Q&A about special equipment. So two examples that occur to me. First, if you had to get some special stuff to clean your offices, cleaning your offices is an administrative fee, a thing that you can spend your money on all the time, however you choose to clean your offices. So I would presume that getting special disinfectant to clean your offices during this period would be eligible for just standard administrative fee expenses. On the other hand, providing voucher holders, for example, with cleaning supplies or protective equipment, masks or gloves or that sort of stuff, is not an ordinary cost that the program would support. And so one of the things to pay attention to is if you've chosen to do things like provide participants with protective equipment, make sure that you can cover those costs with your COVID-19 money. They may not be eligible for your administrative fee money, but your administrative fee money can cover, a pretty broad part of the waterfront on money agencies are spending in connection in responding to this thing. So for providing your remote workers with special equipment, that would that's just what you need to do for standard operations. And so it seems to me that's not a problem.
Okay, thanks, Jim. All right, this next question asks, will there be a waiver or extension for PHAs who have their Chaps from RAD applications to complete the process? Seth said you would take this.
Yeah, so the PIH notice, waiver notice, and doesn't mention RAD, but the multifamily Q&A does extensively. They talk a lot about RAD. They don't answer your particular question, however. They do say that everything in terms of the work at HUD, everything is going on. They do, acknowledge the issue with wet signatures and whether recording offices are open locally. They do talk about the inspections, the capital needs assessment inspections that need to continue, and offer extensions for the rehab period and rehab assistance payments. But I did not see a specific answer to that question, which I am writing down. And Blake, I think we have the information. I can get back to that individual, right?
Yeah, and we will try and answer all of these questions later on the website too. Okay. This next question is regarding evictions. If you had tenants under evictions prior to the COVID-19, should they still be given the additional time, or once the court is reopened, should we continue the eviction process hearing?
Sorry about that. I was typing an answer to another question. On the eviction, I think the question was about, can you proceed if you had already begun a filing? Is that right?
Right.
So if you have filed with the court prior to March 27th and the court is open, you can proceed with that. If you had not filed with the court and not issued the notice to quit, you cannot do so until after July 24th. And then at that point, starting on July 25th, if you're issuing a new notice to the tenant, you do have to give them 30 days. Even if your local law requires a shorter period, the federal law requires that you then give a 30-day notice at the end. But any eviction proceeding that had begun prior to March 27th can proceed to the extent the courts are open. I think that answers the eviction question.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, David. This next question, are there plans to ask for funds for new affordable housing development and or new vouchers? We have a long wait list in the best of times and anticipate a long-term surge in need of affordable housing as a result of COVID-related job loss and business closures. Tim?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the April 8th letter that PHADA and the other industry groups sent to Congress, and which is on the PHADA website, you can take a look at it. We specifically asked for billions more in additional voucher funding. We're calling for a robust increase in the voucher program. So the answer to your question on additional vouchers is absolutely, positively, yes, we're asking for it. And in terms of development, I would say, and invite any other of the other panelists to address this, but we are asking for, as I said, at a minimum, a down payment on the $70 billion backlog in public housing capital needs. We think that that fits in with the theme of infrastructure that the president and many leading members of Congress have talked about, including Maxine Waters in the House. We strongly support her legislation to provide billions of additional funding in preservation funding. So that is a big PHADA priority. I don't know if others want to add to that. Arlene.
Oh, I would just add on for anyone who's interested in LIHTC that there's work being done. We're part of the action campaign, which seeks to strengthen and expand the low-income housing tax credit. And the advocates there are seeking, the whole group, which is made up of about 2,200 organizations across the country, is seeking $10 billion in home funding to help with tenant rents for renters in LIHTC who have lost their income, and some of whom don't have unemployment yet, may be entitled to it, but everyone's heard what the backlog is there. And also to help owners with their additional needs, the same kind of needs that housing authorities have for operating funds in terms of cleaning and sanitizing and all the different things, setting up remote activities so they can continue to operate their properties. And so as part of that effort, there's two different things calling for a increase in a 50% in the total LIHTC allocation over 2 years, so 25% each year, and pushing for a hard 4%. Those were already in play, and there's legislation in which those two provisions are included, but they're ramping up their efforts, thinking this is a good time to be able to develop more affordable housing as well. And some information came out from Nova Gradec last week that says if you get the hard 4%, you will increase affordable housing units over the next, say, 9 years by double what they had previously predicted. So creating about 66,000 new affordable housing units. So we're supporting all of that, and we're working with the Action Campaign, and that's all underway as well.
Thanks, Arlene. Oh, Jim, looks like you have something to add to that.
I just wanted to mention we haven't seen the notice on HAP funding yet that was included in the CARES Act. One of the things that folks probably should keep in mind, we've lost about over 200,000 vouchers that are authorized, but agencies have lost renewal funding for. And a new HAP funding may give an agency, if you have that problem, may give you an opportunity to recover those vouchers. And that would, the 200,000 is a significant number of additional assisted units that could be available depending on local agency circumstances. The other thing is, I think that the point that the questioner makes is to stay in touch with federal policymakers. There are also 200,000 public housing units that have been lost over the past 10 years, which remain authorized. They're part of the Fair Clause limit. And so if funding's available to do that kind of development, it might be possible to recover some of those 200,000 public housing units as well.
Thanks, Jim. All right, we have time for one more question. Like I said, we obviously can't get to all of them, but we will do our best to answer the ones that we did not on our website. This has to do with childcare expenses are eligible for staff who are stuck with children at home due to school closings and daycare closings. The COVID funding can be used to cover childcare costs for a period of time during this crisis so that HA staff persons can return to work. Okay, the question was, can this be used during this period so that staff can return to work? Is that correct?
Yes, for public housing.
And yes for Section 8 as well. That was explicitly stated as one of the uses. And I will just add, even though I think our answers are probably much more in depth, and you'll get both sides of the arguments on each one. People should look at writing to the HUD line. If you have specific questions and you want to feel that HUD has given you the answer just because it makes you feel more protected, every single question I have written to HUD, I have gotten an answer on, and good answers and thorough. And if you don't get the whole answer and you write back, they'll give you more of an answer. So I encourage people to use that, especially, we will, as Blake said, try to answer your questions, but that's another resource as well. And I say use that as well.
Jim, you have something you want to say? Okay. Well, this concludes our current events panel discussion webinar. We'd like to thank all of you for attending today. We'd also like all of you to know that PHADA continues to be in contact with HUD and Congress to advocate for more critical funding, as well as any additional waivers necessary to address HA's concerns in the coming months. PHADA has also been working with its leadership and members to ensure that all interests are represented in our work with HUD and Congress. And if there's anything that you need that you feel is not being addressed, please let us know as soon as possible by emailing info@phada.org. In addition, if you have further questions, we mentioned we'll try and answer the ones that were posed today, but if you have further questions for PHADA staff, please send those also to the info@phada.org email address, and we'll ensure to make sure that your questions are directed to the right individuals. I'd like to remind everyone that a recording of this webinar will be available shortly on PHADA's website, and in just a moment, you'll be redirected to a post-webinar survey. We welcome your participation and feedback, and so that we can continue to do these and do them, give you the information that you need. So we'd like to thank you again for your time today. And we also do want to thank each and every one of you for the hard work that you are doing every day serving your communities during these very difficult times. PHADA will continue to keep you informed of the latest industry news online, on Twitter, via email alerts, video briefs, and again, with more webinars in the near future. Thank you all and be safe.